I should have been afraid of him, but I was too angry to care. The marble floor felt colder than it should have. Or maybe it was just the way my nerves kept misfiring, sending little shocks up my legs as I stood there in the most ridiculous thing I owned. Pink bunny slippers with one ear slightly bent from years of wear. Right in the middle of a penthouse that probably cost more than everything I'd ever touch in my life combined. The elevator doors had closed behind me 30 seconds ago, sealing me into a world that didn't belong to people like me. A world of quiet power where even the air felt controlled, measured, expensive. Men in dark suits had watched me step out, their eyes scanning me from head to toe, pausing just a second too long on my feet like they couldn't quite process what they were seeing, and for a split second, I almost laughed because if I looked this out of place to them, imagine how they looked to me. Like something out of a movie I never bought tickets for. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, his voice low, not threatening, just certain, like he was stating a fact instead of giving a warning. But I didn't stop, didn't even slow down, because if I hesitated now, I knew I'd lose whatever strange courage had carried me this far, the kind that only shows up when anger burns hotter than fear. "I'm not here for you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and I kept walking, each step soft against the polished floor, the faint squeak of rubber soles echoing just enough to remind me how out of place I sounded in this silence, how small I probably looked under the dim, golden lights that reflected off glass walls and endless city skyline beyond. My heart was beating too fast, too loud, like it wanted to betray me, but I ignored it the same way I ignored the way my hands trembled slightly at my sides, because I didn't come all the way up here to turn around, not after what happened, not after seeing my little brother come home with that look in his eyes, the one he tried to hide, the one that said someone bigger, stronger, richer had reminded him exactly where he stood in this world. That thought pushed me forward until I reached the center of the room, where everything opened up into something that didn't even feel real anymore. And that's when I felt it, the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the room itself had decided to hold its breath. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him before I fully faced him, and for a moment, just one, I understood why people whispered about men like him instead of speaking their names out loud. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a dramatic entrance, didn't need to, because the way he stood there, still and composed, carried more weight than any noise ever could, his presence cutting through the space like a line no one dared cross without permission. He looked at me the way people look at something unexpected, not annoyed, not amused, just curious, like I didn't fit into any category he was used to. And somehow that unsettled me more than anger would have. I forced myself to meet his eyes fully, lifting my chin just a little, even though everything in me knew I should look away, because that's what people did around men like him. They lowered their gaze, they stepped back, they made themselves smaller, but I didn't. "You need to tell your men to stop acting like they own people," I said, the words leaving my mouth before doubt could catch up, hanging in the air between us, sharp and simple, and for a second, nothing happened. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the city outside felt distant, like it had been muted just for this moment. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed in his expression, not anger, not offense, but something quieter, something that made my stomach tighten because I couldn't name it, couldn't predict it, couldn't control it. His gaze dropped, just for a heartbeat, landing on my feet, on the soft, worn bunny slippers that had carried me into a place I had no right to stand in. And when his eyes lifted back to mine, there was something new there, something I didn't understand yet, something that made the space between us feel smaller without either of us moving. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just walked into his world. I had interrupted it, and somehow, that mattered more than it should have. He did not answer right away, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any threat could have been. Like the entire room was waiting for him to decide what I was worth, an inconvenience, a mistake, or something else entirely. And I hated that I even thought in those terms because I refused to believe I had walked into a place where my value depended on his opinion. But the way every man around him stood perfectly still, the way no one dared to interrupt, made it impossible to ignore who held control here. He took one step closer, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, the kind of movement that did not need speed to feel powerful, and I noticed everything at once. The sharp lines of his suit, The faint reflection of city lights in his eyes, the quiet confidence that came from someone who had never been told no in any way that mattered. "You walked in here," he said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying across the room without effort, "and decided to tell me what my people should or should not do." It was not a question, and I felt the weight of it press against my chest, but I forced myself to hold his gaze, even when my instincts screamed at me to step back, to soften, to apologize for something I knew was not wrong. "Someone had to," I replied, and my voice came out quieter this time, but not weaker, just more real, because now I was standing close enough to see the small details that made him human despite everything else. The slight crease between his brows, the way his jaw tightened for a second before he relaxed it again, like he was measuring his own reaction as carefully as he measured everything else. Another second passed, then another, and I became painfully aware of the distance between us, less than 3 feet now, close enough that I could feel the heat of the room shift, close enough that I realized I had never stood this near to someone like him before, someone who made the air feel different just by existing in it. "Do you know where you are?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, not mocking, not gentle, just observing. And for a moment, I almost smiled because of course I knew. I had known. The second those elevator doors opened, the second I saw the skyline stretching endlessly behind glass walls that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. "Yes," I said, lifting my chin a fraction higher. "And I still came anyway." That seemed to do something, something small but real, because his expression shifted again, not into anger, not into amusement, but into something sharper, something focused, like I had just become a problem he could not solve the usual way. His gaze dropped again, slower this time, lingering on the bunny slippers like they held some kind of answer he was not expecting to find, and I felt a strange flicker of embarrassment rise in my chest, not because of him, but because I suddenly saw myself the way this room must have seen me, completely out of place, completely unprepared, completely real. "You did not even bother to change," he said, almost to himself, and there was something in his tone I could not quite place, something that did not match the situation, like he was more intrigued than offended, more curious than dismissive. "I was not planning to stay," I answered, and for the first time, a hint of something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, so brief I might have imagined it. But it was there, and it made my pulse skip in a way I did not like, because it meant I was reacting to him, and I did not want to react to anything about this place. He looked at me again, really looked this time, like he was trying to understand how someone could walk into his world without adjusting themselves first, without calculating every move, without trying to fit into the rules that everyone else followed without question. Then he turned slightly, just enough that the men behind him straightened even more, if that was possible, waiting, always waiting, and I realized with a strange clarity that whatever happened next would not just affect me. It would ripple through everything around him, because that was the kind of control he carried. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question caught me off guard, simple and direct in a way that did not match the tension in the room. And for a second, I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because giving him my name felt like giving him something he had not taken yet. "Lily," I said finally, the word leaving my lips softer than I intended, and something in his expression settled, like a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place, even though I had no idea what picture he was trying to build. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if committing it to memory, and then, almost casually, he said, "Find out everything about her, not to me, but to the men behind him." And just like that, the air shifted again, heavier, tighter, because I understood exactly what that meant, even if I did not fully understand why. And as I stood there in my worn slippers on his perfect marble floor, I realized I had not just confronted him. I had made myself impossible for him to ignore. I should have left right then, before his words had time to settle into something real, before the weight of what he had just ordered could follow me out of that room. But my feet did not move, not immediately, because part of me needed to understand why someone like him would care enough to say something like that. Why I had gone from being an interruption to something worth investigating in less than a minute. "You do not need to do that," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that almost looked like surprise cross his face, not because I spoke, but because I dared to correct him, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me again, like they were waiting to see if I had just crossed a line that no one else ever touched. He did not respond right away, and that silence returned, heavier this time, more focused, like it had narrowed down to just the space between the two of us, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat again, steady but loud, refusing to let me forget exactly where I was standing. "You came here," he said slowly, each word placed with intention, and told me how to handle my own people. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and I realized this was not about my brother anymore, not entirely. This was about something else. Now, something I had stepped into without realizing it. "And now you are telling me what I should or should not do again." I swallowed, the smallest movement, but it felt like a decision, like I was choosing whether to step back or hold my ground, and I knew, deep down, that if I backed down now, everything I had just said would lose its meaning. "I am telling you that you already know what is right," I answered, quieter this time, but steady, because I did not need to be loud to be heard, not in a room where even silence carried weight. Something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air had changed direction, and for a second, I thought I saw it clearly. The exact moment he stopped seeing me as a problem and started seeing me as something else, something he could not categorize, something that did not follow the rules he was used to controlling. He stepped past me then, close enough that the movement of air brushed against my sleeve, close enough that I could feel the difference between his world and mine without either of us saying it out loud. And for a brief second, I wondered if that was it, if he was just going to walk away and let me leave like none of this had happened. But then he stopped, just a few steps ahead, his back to me, his posture still composed, still controlled. "Lily," he said, my name sounding different in his voice, more deliberate, like it carried weight I had not given it before, and I turned slightly, not fully, just enough to see the side of his face as he looked out over the city lights stretching endlessly below. "You walked in here like you had nothing to lose." It was not a question, and I did not answer, because I did not know how to explain that sometimes anger makes you forget everything else, that sometimes doing nothing feels worse than taking a risk you do not fully understand. He turned his head just enough to look at me again, and there was something there now that had not been there before, something quieter, more focused, less about control and more about attention. "People like you do not come here," he continued, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, and I felt a strange tension settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, something that came from realizing I had stepped into a space where I did not belong and somehow changed the way it worked, even if just a little. "People like me do not get invited," I replied before I could stop myself, and the words hung there between us, honest and simple, cutting through everything else, and for the first time, he did not look like he was measuring me or analyzing me. He just looked interested, not in the way men usually looked at women, not shallow or obvious, but something deeper, something that made me feel like he was trying to understand a language he had never heard before. He nodded once, slow, like he had just confirmed something to himself, and then he said, "You can go," as if the decision had always been his to make, as if I had not already chosen to walk in and stand my ground in the first place. I hesitated for half a second, just enough to register the way the room shifted again, the way the men around him relaxed slightly, without ever losing their alert posture, and then I turned, forcing my legs to move this time, each step back toward the elevator feeling heavier than the ones that had brought me here. The doors opened almost instantly, like they had been waiting for me, and as I stepped inside, I could still feel his gaze on me, steady and unwavering, following me even as the doors began to close. Just before they shut completely, I looked up one last time, and he was still there, exactly where I had left him, but something had changed, something small and quiet and impossible to ignore, because in that moment, I understood something I had not expected to realize. I had come here to confront him, to demand something simple and leave, but instead, I had left something behind without meaning to, something I could not take back. And as the elevator carried me down, away from his world and back into mine, one thought settled into place with a certainty I could not shake. He was not going to forget me. I told myself it was over the moment I stepped out onto the street, the cold night air hitting my face like a reset button, sharp and real and grounding in a way that his world had not been. And for a few seconds I just stood there on the sidewalk, breathing in the familiar mix of city noise and distant traffic, trying to convince myself that everything that had just happened would stay exactly where I left it, 20 floors above me, behind glass walls and guarded doors, far from the life I understood. My apartment was 12 blocks away, a 15-minute walk if I kept a steady pace, and normally I would have taken a ride. But tonight I needed the distance, needed the movement, needed to feel every step under my feet in those same worn bunny slippers that suddenly felt more significant than they should have, like they had carried me into something I did not fully understand and back out again without falling apart. By the time I reached my building, my heartbeat had finally slowed, my thoughts settling into something that almost resembled normal, and I let myself believe, just for a moment, that I had done what I came to do, and that was it. No consequences, no lingering threads, just a strange story I would never tell anyone because it sounded too unreal to be true. The hallway lights flickered the way they always did, the old wiring humming faintly as I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator that only worked half the time, and everything felt familiar again. The chipped paint on the walls, the distant sound of someone watching television through a thin door, the quiet, imperfect rhythm of a life that made sense to me. When I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath, setting my keys down on the small table by the entrance, letting the silence of my apartment wrap around me like something safe and known, something that did not ask anything from me except to exist in it. I changed out of the slippers, placing them by the door like I always did, but my hand lingered for a second, my fingers brushing over the soft fabric as if I was trying to anchor myself to something simple, something that had not shifted the way everything else had. I told myself I was overthinking, that people like him had bigger things to worry about than a girl who walked in, said her piece, and left, that whatever interest I thought I saw was just my imagination filling in gaps I did not understand, and for a while, that explanation worked. It settled my mind enough for me to move through the rest of my night like usual, heating up leftovers, answering a message from my brother to make sure he was okay, reassuring him in a tone that sounded more confident than I felt, because he did not need to know where I had been or who I had spoken to. But then my phone buzzed, a simple sound that should have meant nothing, just another notification, another routine interruption, except it was not a number I recognized, not a name I had saved, just a message that appeared on my screen without context, without explanation, and for a second I stared at it without opening it, my chest tightening in a way I could not quite explain. It should have been nothing. It could have been anyone. But something in me already knew it was not random, not after tonight, not after the way he had said my name like it meant something more than it should have. I opened the message slowly, my thumb hesitating just for a fraction of a second before I tapped the screen, and the words that appeared were simple, almost too simple, like they had been chosen carefully to say exactly what they needed to without saying anything extra. You should not have walked in there alone. I froze, the room suddenly feeling quieter than before, the familiar walls around me not quite as comforting as they had been just minutes ago, because it was not the message itself that unsettled me. It was the certainty behind it, the quiet assumption that he could reach me here, that the distance I had put between his world and mine was not as solid as I wanted it to be. I did not reply, did not move, just stared at the screen as my mind tried to catch up, tried to decide whether this was a warning, a statement, or something else entirely, something I was not ready to name yet. Then, before I could even process that thought fully, another message appeared, just as brief, just as controlled, and somehow even more unsettling than the first. Next time, do not come alone. And that was when I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit until now. This was not over. Not even close. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to settle, replaying every second of that encounter like it was trying to find something I had missed, some detail that would explain why a man like him would bother sending messages instead of simply forgetting I existed, and the more I thought about it, the less sense it made, which only made it harder to ignore. By morning, I had convinced myself of one thing at least, that I would not respond, because replying meant stepping back into something I did not understand, and silence felt like the only control I had left. The next day started like any other, sunlight filtering through my window, the distant sound of traffic below, the routine of making coffee and checking the time, because being late was not an option when your job depended on showing up exactly when you were expected, no more, no less. I dressed quickly, choosing something simple, something that did not draw attention, because I wanted normal, needed normal, and as I tied my hair back in front of the mirror, I caught my own reflection and paused for a second, studying the same face that had stood in front of him just hours ago, trying to understand how both versions of me could exist at the same time. The walk to work felt shorter than usual, or maybe my thoughts were just louder, filling the space where the city usually did. And by the time I reached the small cafe where I worked, I had pushed everything aside, tucked it away somewhere I could ignore it, because life did not stop just because something unexpected had happened. "You look tired," my coworker said as I stepped behind the counter, her voice light, casual, unaware of anything beyond what she could see, and I forced a small smile, nodding like it was nothing, like I had just had a late night instead of something far more complicated. The morning rush came quickly, orders stacking up, the familiar rhythm of taking requests, making drinks, calling names, the kind of repetition that usually grounded me, but today it felt different, like I was moving through it slightly out of sync, like part of my attention was somewhere else entirely. I was handing a cup to a customer when I felt it, that same subtle shift I had noticed before, the one that did not belong in ordinary moments, and my hand paused just slightly before I set the drink down, my eyes lifting instinctively toward the window without fully knowing why. At first, I did not see anything unusual, just people passing by, cars moving along the street, the everyday motion of the city continuing like it always did. But then I noticed it, a black car parked across the street, not out of place by itself, but too still, too deliberate, like it had been there longer than it needed to be. I told myself I was imagining things, that not everything connected back to him, that I was letting one encounter change the way I saw everything else. And for a moment, that explanation almost worked, until the door opened and the small bell above it rang softly, drawing my attention back inside. I turned automatically, ready to greet whoever had walked in, the words forming out of habit before I even saw their face, but they never left my mouth, because it was not just anyone. It was one of the men from the night before, the same dark suit, the same controlled posture, standing just inside the doorway like he belonged there even though everything about him said otherwise, and for a second, the entire cafe seemed to quiet down, not completely, just enough that I could feel the difference, like the air had shifted again in that same familiar way. He did not approach right away, did not speak, just looked at me with the same measured attention I had seen before, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not exactly, but something close to it, something that came from realizing that whatever I thought I had left behind had just found me again. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from the counter, close enough that there was no pretending this was coincidence. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying only to me despite the noise around us. "He does not like being ignored," he said, not threatening, not aggressive, just certain, and for a moment, I did not respond, because I understood exactly who he meant without needing to ask, and that understanding settled into something deeper, something heavier, because it meant this was no longer just about one night or one conversation. It meant he had decided I mattered enough to follow up, and I was not sure if that was a good thing. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not because I was trying to challenge him, but because I needed to remind myself that this was still my space, my job, my life, and no matter who he worked for, he was the one standing across the counter now, not the man who controlled everything from a distance. "Then maybe he should learn to wait," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady as I reached for the next cup like nothing had changed, like this was just another customer interaction and not something that had shifted the air around us again. The man did not react the way most people would have, no surprise, no irritation, just that same controlled stillness, like he had expected resistance and already accounted for it. And that realization made something in my chest tighten, because it meant this was not new to them. This kind of dynamic, this quiet push and pull where control was tested without ever being openly challenged. "He is not used to that," he replied, his tone even, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested this was more than just a message being delivered. It was an observation, a statement about the kind of man Adrian Volkov was and the kind of world he operated in. I set the cup down in front of a waiting customer, forcing myself to focus on the routine, the familiar movements that grounded me. Because if I let myself fully engage in this moment, I knew it would pull me deeper into something I was not ready to understand. "That is not my problem," I said, finally looking back at him. And for the first time, there was a slight shift in his expression, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to catch it, like I had just confirmed something he had been sent to verify. He reached into his jacket then, slow and deliberate, pulling out a small card and placing it gently on the counter between us, not pushing it toward me, not forcing it into my space, just setting it there like an option, like a choice. "He would prefer if you contacted him directly," he said, and I glanced down at the card without picking it up, my eyes tracing the clean, minimal design, a name, a number, nothing else, no explanation, no context, just a direct line into a world I had no business stepping into again. For a moment, neither of us moved, the noise of the cafe continuing around us, orders being called, cups being filled, people talking without any awareness of what was happening just a few feet away, and the contrast felt almost unreal, like two completely different realities existing side by side without touching. "And if I do not?" I asked, my voice softer now, not weaker, just more measured, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about understanding what came next. He met my eyes without hesitation, and there was no threat in his expression, no pressure, just a simple, unshakable certainty. "Then he will come to you again," he said, and something about the way he said it made it clear that this was not speculation, not a possibility, but a decision that had already been made somewhere far above both of us. I felt my breath catch slightly, just for a second, because that meant this was not something I could ignore my way out of, not something that would fade if I pretended it did not exist, and that realization settled into something heavier than I wanted to admit. I looked down at the card again, still untouched on the counter, and for the first time, I understood that leaving it there was not the same as refusing it, that even the act of not picking it up had meaning now, had consequences I could not fully see yet. When I looked back up, the man was already stepping away, his job done, his message delivered, blending back into the flow of people like he had never been there at all, and for a moment, I almost questioned whether any of this had really happened, except the card was still there, small and simple and impossible to ignore. I stared at it for a few seconds longer than I should have, my mind running through every possible outcome, every version of what this could turn into, and none of them felt simple anymore. Because the truth was, this was no longer just about standing my ground or walking away. This was about what happened when someone like him decided you were worth his attention. And I was starting to realize that attention did not come with an easy exit. I told myself I would leave the card there, that I would finish my shift, go home, and pretend none of this had happened again. But that was before I realized how difficult it was to ignore something once it had been placed directly in front of you. Simple and quiet and waiting, like a decision that refused to disappear no matter how long you looked away. For the next hour, I moved through the motions of work the same way I always did, taking orders, making drinks, calling names, but everything felt slightly off, like the rhythm I relied on had shifted just enough to keep me from settling back into it completely. And every time I passed by the register, my eyes flicked toward the card without meaning to, like it was pulling my attention in a way I could not control. I tried to reason through it, to tell myself that picking it up did not mean anything, that it was just a piece of paper, just a number, but the truth was, I knew better, because nothing about this had been random so far, nothing had been accidental, and that meant even the smallest choice carried more weight than it should have. "You okay?" my coworker asked at one point, her voice cutting through my thoughts, and I realized I had been staring at the same spot for a second too long. My hands paused mid-motion, as if I had forgotten what I was doing. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing myself back into the moment, finishing the drink in front of me and sliding it across the counter with a practiced smile that felt just a little less natural than usual. But even as I moved, even as I focused on everything else, the awareness did not leave. It stayed there, quiet and persistent, reminding me that I was standing at the edge of something I did not fully understand. By the time my shift ended, the cafe had emptied out, the rush replaced by a slower, quieter pace, and I found myself alone behind the counter for a brief moment, the kind of pause that usually felt like relief, but now felt like something else entirely. The card was still there, exactly where it had been left, untouched, waiting, and I stood there for a few seconds, just looking at it, my mind running through the same loop it had been stuck in all day, weighing options that did not feel equal, considering outcomes I could not predict. Then, slowly, before I could overthink it again, I reached out and picked it up, the motion small but final, the smooth surface cool against my fingers as I turned it over once, as if there might be something else hidden there, some explanation that would make this simpler, but there was not, just the same name, the same number, direct and unambiguous. I slipped it into my pocket before I could change my mind, telling myself it was just to get it out of sight, just to stop thinking about it. But even as I did it, I knew that was not the whole truth. Outside, the air had cooled, the late afternoon fading into evening, and I walked the same route home as always, but everything felt sharper now, more defined, like my awareness had shifted in a way I could not reverse, and I caught myself noticing things I usually ignored, the way people moved, the way cars slowed at intersections, the way certain moments stretched just a second longer than they should have. When I reached my building, I paused at the entrance, my hand resting on the door handle as I took a breath, trying to decide what I was going to do next, because picking up the card had been one thing, but using it was something else entirely. My phone felt heavier in my pocket, like it was waiting, like it already knew what I was thinking before I had fully decided, and for a second, I almost laughed at myself because this should not have been complicated. It should have been simple. Ignore it. Move on. Go back to normal. But normal did not feel the same anymore, not after everything that had already happened. I stepped inside, climbing the stairs. Slowly this time, my thoughts quieter now, more focused, and by the time I reached my door, I had made a decision, not a full one, not something that answered everything, but enough to move forward. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen for a second before unlocking it, my thumb hovering just above the keypad as I took one more breath, steady and controlled, the way I had forced it to be when I stood in front of him. Then, before I could hesitate again, I typed a single message, simple, direct, just enough to open the door without stepping all the way through it. This is Lily. And as soon as I pressed send, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back now. I expected to feel relief after sending the message, like making a decision would settle something inside me. But instead it did the opposite. It sharpened everything, made every second feel more intentional, more fragile, like I had just stepped onto a path that would not let me turn around halfway. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, blinking on the screen before I even had time to lock my phone. And that alone told me more than any words could have, because it meant he had been waiting, not casually, not coincidentally, but with purpose, with attention that did not drift. My breath slowed without me realizing it, my eyes fixed on the screen as if looking away would somehow change what came next, and then the reply came through, simple, direct, exactly the way he spoke. I know. 2 words, nothing more, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten, because of course he knew. He had known the moment I picked up that card, maybe even before that, like every step I thought was my choice had already been anticipated. I stared at the message longer than I should have, my mind trying to decide what to say next, what response would keep control on my side of this conversation, but the truth was, I was not sure there was one. Before I could type anything, another message appeared. You took longer than I expected. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall beside my door, the cool surface grounding me as I read the words again, because there was something in them that felt less like criticism and more like observation, like he was studying me even now, measuring time, reactions, decisions. I had work. I typed back after a moment, keeping it simple, refusing to give more than necessary, my thumb hovering for a second before I sent it, knowing every word mattered in a way I was still learning to understand. The response came faster this time. You should not have to deal with this while working. I frowned slightly, reading it twice, because it did not sound like a threat, did not sound like control, but it was still something, still a statement that crossed into my world without asking permission, and I did not like how easily he did that. I handle my own problems, I replied, the words firm, deliberate, because I needed to draw a line somewhere, even if I did not know how solid it would be. There was a pause then, longer than before, just a few seconds, but enough for me to feel it, enough for me to wonder if I had pushed too far again. If this was the moment things shifted in a direction I could not control, But when the next message came, it was not what I expected. "I noticed," he wrote, and for some reason, those two words unsettled me more than anything else, because they meant he had been paying attention, not just to what I said, but to how I said it, to how I stood, how I walked into his space without hesitation, and that kind of attention was not something I knew how to ignore. My phone buzzed again before I could respond. "Tomorrow, 8 p.m. I will send a car." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening again, not from fear, but from the sudden shift, the way he moved from conversation to decision without asking, without waiting for agreement, and something in me pushed back immediately. "No." I typed, the words short, clear, sitting there on the screen like a boundary I was trying to establish, and for a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched just long enough for doubt to creep in, for me to question whether that had been the right move, whether I had just made things more complicated. But then the reply came, and it was different this time, not just controlled, but precise, like he had adjusted something in response to me. "Then tell me where." I blinked, reading it again, because that was not what I expected, not a demand, not a correction, but a shift, small but real, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, something I had not realized was tight until now. He was not pulling me into his world this time. He was stepping into mine, and somehow, that made this even more complicated than before. I stared at his message longer than I should have, my thumb hovering just above the screen as if the right answer would somehow appear if I waited long enough. But it did not, because there was no simple answer here, not anymore, not after everything had already shifted in ways I could not undo. He had adjusted. That was the part that stayed with me, the way he had not pushed back against my refusal but instead moved around it. Like control to him was not about forcing outcomes, but about finding another path to the same result. And that realization made this feel less like a conversation and more like something carefully constructed. I told myself I could still walk away, that not replying now would end this just as easily as it had begun. But I knew that was not true, not after he had already reached into my world once, not after he had shown me he was willing to step closer instead of pulling me in. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the door, grounding myself in the familiar texture of chipped paint and quiet space. And then I made a choice, not because I was certain, but because standing still felt worse. "The cafe," I typed, my fingers steady now, the words simple, direct, offering him something small but controlled, a place I understood, a space that belonged to me. I hesitated for half a second before adding, "After my shift." It felt important to say that, to set a boundary even within the invitation, to remind both of us that my life did not revolve around his schedule, that I still decided when and where I showed up. The response came almost immediately, like he had expected that answer, like he had already adjusted his plans before I even finished typing. 8:30, he replied, and I noticed the difference right away, not a demand, not a command, but a confirmation, like we had just agreed on something without saying it out loud. And that subtle shift unsettled me more than if he had insisted on his own terms. I did not respond again after that, not because I had nothing to say, but because I needed space to process what I had just agreed to. And for the rest of the evening, I moved through my apartment with a quiet awareness that something had been set in motion, something that would not stop just because I felt unsure about it. The next day passed slower than usual, every hour stretching just a little longer, every task feeling slightly heavier, like time itself was building towards something I could not avoid. And by the time my shift started, I had already replayed the upcoming conversation in my mind more times than I could count, trying to predict what he would say, how he would act, whether he would feel different outside of that penthouse, away from the controlled environment where everything seemed to revolve around him. The cafe was busy that evening, the kind of steady flow that kept me moving without pause. And for a while, that helped. It kept my mind focused on something immediate, something real, but as the clock moved closer to 8, that same subtle tension returned, creeping in at the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that this was not just another shift, not just another night. At 8:25, I found myself glancing toward the door more often than I meant to, my attention splitting between the work in front of me and the space just beyond the glass, and I hated that. Hated the way anticipation had found its way in without permission, but I could not deny it was there. Then the bell above the door rang, soft and ordinary, The same sound I heard dozens of times a day, but this time it landed differently, sharper, more defined, and I looked up before I could stop myself. He did not rush in, did not announce himself, did not need to, because the moment he stepped inside, the entire room seemed to adjust around him in a way that was impossible to ignore, like something invisible had shifted just enough for everyone to feel it without understanding why. Adrian. Volkov stood there for a second, his gaze finding mine almost instantly, like he had known exactly where to look. And for a moment, everything else faded into the background. The noise, the movement, the routine, all of it dimming just enough for me to feel the weight of that single connection across the room. He took a few steps forward, slow and controlled, stopping just short of the counter. And even here, in my world, in a place that was supposed to belong to me, he carried that same presence, that same quiet authority that did not need to be announced to be felt. "You chose well," he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond me, but clear enough that every word settled exactly where he intended, and I felt my breath catch for just a second before I steadied it again, forcing myself to stand the same way I had the first night, not backing down, not stepping aside, even though this felt different now, more real, more complicated, because this was no longer a confrontation. This was a choice, and I had just made it. For a moment, I did not answer, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I needed to understand what had just changed, what it meant for him to stand here instead of there, for him to step into my world without bringing the weight of his with him, or at least not in a way that crushed everything around it. "It is just a cafe," I said finally, keeping my voice even as I reached for a cup, giving my hands something to do so I would not stand there frozen under his gaze, because that was the one thing I refused to give him, that kind of control over how I moved, how I reacted. "That is exactly why," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made me glance up again, something quieter than before, less about observation and more about intention, like he had chosen this moment just as carefully as he chose everything else. I handed the drink to the customer waiting at the counter, my focus shifting back and forth between the routine and the presence in front of me, aware of the way the space felt slightly different now. Not louder, not chaotic, just aware, like something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. "You said you wanted to talk," I said, turning back to him, keeping my voice low enough that it stayed between us, because this was not something I wanted to become visible to anyone else. Not here, not in a place that was supposed to stay simple. He nodded once, his gaze steady, not moving away even as people passed behind him, as if everything else in the room existed on a different level that did not require his attention. "I wanted to see if you would come," he said, and the honesty in that caught me off guard for a second, because it was not what I expected, not a strategy, not a demand, just a statement that felt more personal than it should have. "I said I would," I replied, a little more firmly than necessary, because I did not like the implication that I might not have, that my choices were something to be tested instead of taken at face value. "People say many things," he answered calmly, and there was no challenge in it, no accusation, just a simple acknowledgement of how the world usually worked, and I realized that for him, trust was not something given easily, not something assumed, but something observed over time, measured in actions instead of words. I leaned slightly against the counter, crossing my arms without thinking, creating a small barrier between us, not to push him away, but to remind myself where I stood, where this conversation existed. "Then you have seen enough now," I said, meeting his eyes again, and for a second, something flickered there, something close to approval, though I could not be sure, because he did not show it openly, not in a way that made it easy to read. "Not yet," he said quietly, and those two words settled between us with more weight than anything else he had said so far, because they suggested something ongoing, something unfinished, and I felt a small tension rise in my chest again, not fear, but awareness, like I was standing at the edge of something that had not revealed its full shape yet. "What do you want from me?" I asked, the question coming out more direct than I intended, but it needed to be asked, needed to be clear, because I was not going to stand here guessing at his intentions while he stayed 3 steps ahead. He did not answer right away, and that pause told me more than a quick response would have, because it meant he was choosing his words carefully, not reacting, not improvising, but deciding exactly what to say and what to leave out. "Clarity," he said finally, And I frowned slightly. The word unexpected, too simple for something that felt this complicated. About what? I asked, and this time, when he looked at me, there was no distance in his gaze, no detachment, just a focused attention that made everything else feel quieter for a second. About why you walked into my world without hesitation, he said, and I felt my breath catch just slightly, because that question went deeper than anything we had said so far, deeper than the situation, deeper than the surface reasons I had given myself, and I realized then that this conversation was not just about what had happened. It was about what it meant, and I was not sure I had an answer ready for that. I did not answer right away, not because I did not hear the question, but because it landed deeper than I expected, somewhere past the surface reasons I had been holding on to, somewhere closer to something I had not fully admitted even to myself. The cafe noise continued around us, cups clinking, low conversations blending into a steady hum, but it all felt distant for a second, like it had been pushed back just enough to leave space for what he had just asked. I had a reason, I said finally, keeping my voice steady, but I knew it was not enough. Not for him, not for the way he watched me now, like he was waiting for the part one had not said yet. That is not what I asked, he replied, not harsh, not impatient, just precise, and I felt that same quiet pressure again, the kind that did not force answers but made it difficult to avoid them. I shifted slightly, uncrossing my arms without realizing it, my fingers brushing against the edge of the counter as I grounded myself in something physical, something real, because this was not just a conversation anymore. It was something closer to being seen in a way I was not used to. Because someone needed to say it, I said, meeting his eyes again, and this time I did not look away, even when I felt the weight of his attention settle more firmly, more intentionally, like he was measuring not just my words, but the space between them. People in your world do not hear things like that often. He studied me for a second longer, and I could not tell if what I said satisfied him or only made him more curious, because his expression did not change in any obvious way, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but real, like he had adjusted his understanding by just a fraction. And you decided that should be you, he said, and there was something in the way he phrased it, not disbelief, not judgment, just acknowledgement, like he was stating a fact that did not quite fit into his expectations. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because hearing it said that way made it sound simpler than it felt. I did not think about it that much, I admitted, and that was closer to the truth than anything else I had said so far, because in that moment, it had not been a decision, it had been instinct, something immediate and unfiltered that I could not take back even if I wanted to. His gaze did not leave mine, and for the first time, I noticed something different there, not just attention, not just calculation, but something quieter, something that looked almost like understanding, even if it was incomplete. Most people think, he said, his voice lower now, less formal, less distant, before they step into something they cannot control. I felt that settle in my chest, the implication of it, the way he framed the world in terms of control and the absence of it, and I realized then how different our perspectives were, how natural it was for him to expect hesitation, to expect calculation, because that was the environment he came from. Maybe that is why nothing changes, I replied softly, the words coming out before I could filter them, and for a second, I wondered if I had pushed too far again, if I had stepped into that same space where lines blurred without warning. But he did not react the way I expected. He did not pull back, did not close off. Instead, he watched me with that same focused attention, and there was something in it now that felt less like observation and more like engagement, like this was no longer just about understanding me, but about testing something within himself as well. You believe you can change things by walking into them without fear, he said, and it was not a question, but it felt like one, like he was offering me a chance to confirm or deny it. I held his gaze for a second longer, aware of how quiet everything felt again, how the space between us seemed to narrow without either of us moving. I believe someone has to try, I answered, and the simplicity of it felt almost fragile in this moment, like it could break under the weight of everything he represented, everything his world stood for. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, and for the first time since he walked in, I felt the tension shift in a way I could not fully explain, like something had settled into place, not resolved, not finished, but understood just enough to move forward. "That is why you interest me," he said quietly, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said, not because of what they meant, but because of how simply he said them, like it was not a confession or a strategy, just a fact he had accepted. And for a second, I did not know what to do with that, because being noticed was one thing. But being understood, even partially, by someone like him, that was something else entirely. For a moment, I did not respond, not because I did not understand what he meant, but because I was not sure how to react to the way he said it, so simply, so directly, like my presence in his mind had already been decided without needing anything more from me. "That sounds like your problem," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could soften them, and I watched closely this time, waiting to see if that would shift something in him, if it would push him back into the version of himself I expected, the one who controlled everything and did not tolerate resistance. But it did not. Instead, something almost imperceptible changed, not in his expression, but in the way he held his attention on me, like he was adjusting again, recalibrating instead of reacting, and that unsettled me more than any display of power could have. "It is," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, no irritation, just agreement, like he had already accepted that before I said it. And that made it harder to keep my footing in this conversation because I could not predict him the way I thought I could. I shifted slightly, glancing down at the counter for a second before looking back up, grounding myself in the familiar surface beneath my hands, because I needed to remind myself where I was, who I was, what mattered outside of this moment. "Then maybe you should let it go," I added, more measured this time, not pushing, just stating what felt obvious from my side of things, because whatever this was, whatever interest he thought he had, it did not belong in my life, not in any way that made sense. He studied me again, and this time the silence stretched longer, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like he was considering something more carefully than before, and I felt that same quiet tension build again, not sharp, not overwhelming, just present, like a line being drawn in a place I could not fully see yet. "That would be the logical choice," he said finally, and there was something in his tone that made me pay closer attention, something that suggested he was not finished, that the thought did not end there. "But you did not make a logical choice when you walked into my world." I felt that settle into me, the way he framed it, not as a mistake, not as something reckless, but as something outside of his expectations, something that had disrupted the patterns he was used to relying on, and for a second, I did not know how to respond because he was not wrong. "Maybe not everything needs to be logical," I said, my voice softer now, not because I was unsure, but because the conversation had shifted into something quieter, something less about proving a point and more about understanding where we stood. He held my gaze, and there was something there now that had not been there at the beginning, something less distant, less guarded, like he was allowing a fraction more of himself into the space between us, even if it was small, even if it was controlled. "That is what makes this difficult," he said, and the honesty in that caught me off guard again, because it was not something I expected him to admit, not in this setting, not in this way, and it made the moment feel heavier, more real than anything else that had happened so far. I let out a small breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly without me realizing it, because for the first time, this did not feel like a confrontation or a test. It felt like something else entirely, something that did not fit into the categories I had been trying to place it in. "Then maybe you should stop trying to understand it," I said, and this time there was no edge to my voice, no challenge, just a simple suggestion, because sometimes the more you tried to define something, the more complicated it became. He watched me for a second longer, and I could not tell if he agreed or not, if he would take that advice or dismiss it, because he did not respond right away, and that silence returned one more time, quieter now, less tense, but still carrying weight. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, not rushed, not abrupt, just a small movement that drew my attention without demanding it, and he placed something on the counter in front of me, not pushing it forward, just leaving it there the same way his man had earlier, but this time it felt different, more intentional, more personal. "This is not about understanding," he said, his voice low, steady. "It is about choosing not to ignore it." I looked down at what he had placed there, not touching it yet, just taking in the shape, the simplicity of it, and I felt something shift again, something deeper this time, Because this was not just his attention anymore, not just his curiosity. This was something he had decided to act on. And for the first time, I realized I might not be the only one stepping into something without fully understanding where it would lead. I did not touch it at first, not because I was afraid of what it was, but because I understood what it represented, and I needed a second to decide whether I was ready. To acknowledge that shift, that moment where something unspoken became real simply by being placed between us. The cafe noise returned slowly around me, like the world was easing back into place after holding its breath, but it felt different now, not because anything had changed outwardly, but because I had. I looked up at him again, searching his expression for something I could anchor to, something predictable, but there was nothing obvious there, just that same quiet certainty, that same controlled presence that did not need to explain itself to be understood. "You always do this?" I asked softly, my voice steady but quieter than before, because this no longer felt like a conversation meant to be overheard, even if no one around us was paying attention. "Decide things for other people without asking?" He did not react immediately, and for a second, I thought he might dismiss the question, move past it the way he had moved past everything else that did not fit his direction. But then he shook his head slightly, the movement small but deliberate. "No," he said, and there was something in the way he answered that made me pause, because it did not sound like a defense, it sounded like a distinction. "Only when I am certain." I felt that settle into me, the weight of it, the implication that whatever this was, whatever decision he thought he had made, it was not casual to him, not something he would reconsider easily, and that realization should have pushed me away, should have made this simpler, clearer, but instead it did the opposite. It made it harder to ignore. I glanced down at the object again, finally letting my fingers move, brushing lightly against it before picking it up, the motion slow, intentional, because this was not just about curiosity anymore. It was about acknowledging that I was still standing here, still part of this moment, even after everything that had already happened. It was a key, small and polished, attached to a simple metal tag with an address engraved into it. Not flashy, not exaggerated, just precise, like everything else about him, and I felt my breath catch slightly as I read it, because I recognized the location, not from experience, but from reputation, the kind of place people talked about without ever stepping inside. "You expect me to just accept this?" I asked, looking back up at him, and this time there was something closer to disbelief in my voice, not because I did not understand what he was offering, but because I did, and that made it more complicated than anything else we had said so far. He held my gaze without hesitation, and for a moment, the distance between us felt smaller than it should have, like the space itself had shifted to accommodate something neither of us had fully defined yet. "I expect you to decide," he said, and there was no pressure in it, no demand, just that same quiet certainty, like he was placing the choice in my hands instead of taking it, even if everything about him suggested he could have done the opposite. I let out a slow breath, my fingers still wrapped loosely around the key, feeling its weight in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size, because it was not just metal, not just an object, it was a door, an invitation, a line I could cross or walk away from. And for the first time, I realized that this was not about control anymore, not entirely. It was about whether I was willing to step into something I could not fully see yet, the same way I had stepped into his world that first night without hesitation, without logic, guided by something I had not questioned at the time. I looked at him one more time, searching for something, anything that would make this easier, but there was nothing there except the truth of the moment, simple and undeniable. He could have ignored me. He could have dismissed me, but he did not. And now, I had to decide what that meant. I closed my fingers slightly around the key, not fully committing, not pulling away, just holding it there as the weight of the decision settled into place. And for a second, everything felt quiet again, like the world was waiting to see which direction I would choose. Because he might have ruled his world with certainty. But this was mine to answer.